54 years ago, 600 nonviolent protesters set off to march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, to protest the disenfranchisement of black voters in the South. They got as far as the Edmund Pettus Bridge when they saw police officers lined up on the other end, waiting with tear gas, clubs, and dogs. The iconic bridge stood between police and protesters like a physical barrier between hope and violence, democracy, and second-class citizenship. Although the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were cemented into law for freedom, citizenship, and voting rights of black Americans, passed nearly 100 years earlier across the country, literacy tests, poll tax, violence, and intimidation stood in the way of this constitutional promise. This was especially true in Alabama. According to the 1961 Civil Rights Commission report, at the time of the famous protests, fewer than 10% of the voting-age black population was registered in Alabama's Montgomery County. This infamous march from Selma was intended to right the wrong, to shine light on the injustice of all the many laws that kept voting from being accessible to black Americans. For months leading up to it, a community of activists led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and, of course, our esteemed colleague, Representative John Lewis, carried out voting registration drives and nonviolent demonstrations, all against the resistance of the local government and members of the Ku Klux Klan. These efforts laid the groundwork for the March from Selma, which ended with Alabama state troopers attacking the protesters. The images of the state-sponsored violence was shown across the country, galvanizing the American public in favor of voting rights in a day that has since become known as Bloody Sunday. 5 months later, on August 6, 1965, the Voting Rights Act was signed into law. The bill is one of the crowning victories of the civil rights movement and for our American democracy. This monumental legislation outlawed the malicious barriers to the polls and held states accountable for discriminatory obstacles imposed on citizens who sought to fulfill their constitutional right. It opened doors for black citizens across the South to register, cast a vote, run for office in higher numbers than ever before. So, Mr. President, as we celebrate this February as Black History Month, we must remember that black history is American history. We must remember that too often in our nation's past, the work to create a more perfect union has fallen upon the shoulders of Americans whose full rights and citizenship was discounted simply because of the color of their skin. The right to vote is a fundamental American tenet, yet has historically been denied to men and women of color. We must remember that when we tell stories of those who fought and struggled to secure voting rights in our nation's past, it's because their stories serve as a precursor to our own. Today, voting rights are still under attack. Many who survived the brutal attack on Bloody Sunday and lived to see the passage of the Voting Rights Act have also lived to see the same monumental bill weakened by the 2013 Shelby County Supreme Court decision. They have watched our president and Republican legislators tout myths of voter fraud to justify strict voter ID laws, partisan gerrymandering, and limited access to voting information. These efforts undoubtedly disadvantage black Americans more than most and put a scourge on the system that defines our democracy. It is an insult to those who were robbed of their freedom and oftentimes their lives to create a more equal future. One such example of modern voter disenfranchisement can be found in the fact that the United States denies voting rights to citizens with felony convictions. We are one of the exceedingly few Western democracies that permanently strips citizens of their right to vote as a punishment for their crimes. Let's be clear, we are not talking about voting rights for felons currently incarcerated. We are talking about voting rights for those who have served their time and have since been released, attained jobs, raised a family, paid taxes, and moved on with their lives. Under the current law in 34 states, these individuals are still denied the right to vote, and that's simply unfair and undemocratic. Black History Month demands that we bring this injustice to light because felony disenfranchisement disproportionately affects men and women of color. 1 out of every 13 black Americans is currently unable to vote because of a prior conviction for which they have already served time, a rate that is more than 4 times greater than the non-black Americans. In total, more than 2 million Americans are right now unable to vote because of prior convictions, despite having already served their time and paying their debt to society. That is why this year I will again be introducing the Democracy Restoration Act, a bill that would restore voting rights to individuals after they have been released and returned to their community. I'm committed to seeing this legislation passed, and my hope is that Black History Month inspires all my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me. We must also combat efforts to intimidate and disenfranchise voters. That's why last year I introduced legislation that would prohibit and penalize knowingly spreading misinformation, such as incorrect polling locations, times, or the necessary forms of identification. This Deceptive Practices of Voter Intimidation Prevention Act would prohibit and penalize intentionally and knowingly spreading misinformation to voters that are intended to suppress the vote, including the time and place of an election and restrictions on voter eligibility. Reliably, these tactics always seem to target minority neighborhoods and are blatant attempts to reduce turnout. Such tactics undermine and corrode our very democracy and threaten the integrity of our electoral system. Mr. President, in Stacey Abrams' response to the State of the Union last week, she said that the foundation of our moral leadership around the globe is free and fair elections, where voters pick their leaders, not where politicians pick their voters. This is precisely why I've chosen to speak out about voting rights this month, because this issue defines our moral and democratic character as a nation, and because it's an area where we still have so much work left to do. Casting a vote is one of the most basic, fundamental freedoms in any democracy, and Congress has the responsibility to ensure the right is protected. Congress has a responsibility to remove barriers to voting and make it easier for people to register to vote, cast their vote, and make sure their votes are counted. No one can appreciate the need for us to meet this responsibility better than Black Americans, whose collective story is one of triumph over racist laws and undemocratic norms. On Black History Month, Congress must vow to follow their example and work together across party lines to make voting easier, fairer, and more accessible to all.